Thank you very much for that fine speech, aided by Leonis's Siri, I'm sure. I'm now going to call the second speaker of the opposition, Louis Davidson. Louis Davidson is a third-year student of Psychological and Behavioural Sciences studying at Hobbiton College. He also served as the Speakers Officer for the Cambridge Union in Easter 2024. Louis, you have the ears of the House.
Right. Good evening, everyone. To claim that identity politics are a distraction is to fundamentally misunderstand mechanisms of power and the ways in which systemic oppression operates. This assertion neglects the intersectional and biopolitical realities of human lives and the necessity of collective struggle informed by those realities. Tonight, I will start by distinguishing right-wing responses to and tropes of identity politics that seek to delegitimize social justice movements. I will secondly clarify failures of liberal identity politics centering individualism and superficial change. And I will finally present what I propose as constructive identity politics that center systems of oppression and more effectively dismantle the hierarchies that perpetuate exploitation and injustice. For identity politics, far from being a distraction, is a necessary mechanism for radical social change. For any revolutionary moment or movement, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, a thorough confrontation with historic settler colonialism and white supremacy is indispensable. W.E.B. Du Bois writes of a militarized identity politics oriented by whiteness, which emerged as a class collaborationist tool during European colonization of the Americas. Rivalries were subsumed under this broader identity, designed to facilitate conquest against indigenous people and maintain the subjugation of enslaved Africans. We can see more recent misappropriations of identity politics with the EDL protests built on moral panics of white replacement conspiracy theories. This is not identity politics, this is hate. The Black Panther Party, to some, the most effective black revolutionary organization of the 20th century, fought for free breakfast for children and community health clinics while resisting police brutality. Not right now, thank you. The British Black Panthers continued grassroots organizing and legislative advocacy in the UK. Anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter pushed for police federal oversight and leveraged digital vigilantism for accountability. This represents an orienting around blackness as a means of stipulating structural change by challenging systemic racism. I can take your point now.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Maxwell, if the Black Panthers are the most effective black revolutionary force in history, could you name some lasting accomplishment of the Black Panther Party?
I said some may say it, but I am of the belief that that they were revolutionary in what they did. They brought institutional racism to the limelight. They brought the fact that there is institutional racism in the US to the hindsight and to the limelight. And they also fueled future black revolutionary movements as well. So I mentioned the Black Panthers UK that fought for legislative change. There was the Race Relations Act of 1976 that was designed to prevent discrimination on racial grounds and promote equality between racial groups. So there is real structural change offered here. Continuing, today's political climate of vicious attacks against marginalized communities is obvious to me. Neo-fascist figures like Nigel Farage are at the forefront of such culture wars, embodying a broader trend in British politics. The government's failures are being excused by scapegoating minorities. We need an identity politics that recognizes the specificity of forms of othering to stimulate political liberation. It allows us to aspire to a justice for all that helps us to understand boundaries, who is left out, and how we can fortify justice. When we dismiss these as mere identity projects, we are remaining complacent with a status quo of exclusion. For those who suggest that identity politics distracts from the real issues, Judith Butler's concept and work on performativity provides a critical response. Identity itself is a site of political contestation. Simply by finding commonalities within socially constructed group categorization, we can connect and we can bring collective struggle to the foreground. There's also this reluctance to embrace the idea that the personal is political, which lies at the center of identity politics. So perhaps identity politics, it creates a false distinction, and we could debate the utility of the term itself, but I want to emphasize that through these identities, we can navigate and resist the forces that work to restrict freedoms. To suggest that identity politics distract is to erase the lived realities of those for whom identity has been a battleground imposed from birth. The identity politics that I propose is a framework in which identity-based issues enter into public consciousness as sites of struggle, transforming private struggles into catalysts for social movements. Queer people across cultures and history have been forced to resist the attacks they receive simply because their identities constitute a particular existence that challenges a heterosexual matrix. They are abjected in their relationality to dominant axes of power in Western society, and this poses material consequences for how they can live their lives. The imposition of a gender binary was one of the first recorded acts of colonial violence by European colonizers, fueling a systemic erasure of Native American Two-Spirit populations. The Nazis' looting of the Institute of Sexology reflects an epistemically violent elimination of valuable medical research on trans and intersex people. Although these historic wrongs cannot be said to be righted, and there's still a lot of work to be done, a unified LGBT+ movement has succeeded in fighting for same-sex marriage, anti-discrimination laws, and hate crime legislation. Through the feminist movement, women in solidarity challenge gender-based violence. Sisters Uncut mobilize against austerity, police authority and prisons, privatized healthcare, and arms sales to the Israeli government, recognizing their disproportionate impact on women. Collective action informed by identity politics demands accountability and reimagines justice outside and beyond oppressive frameworks. Movements like Reclaim the Night and #MeToo challenge rape culture and systemic misogyny. At its strongest, feminism is intersectional. Organizing movements that are precise and effective, it rejects the white bourgeois feminism over the struggles of working class women of color, for example, who face patriarchal structures too, but don't necessarily benefit from that #girlboss, girl power brand of feminism. Identity politics in this form challenges the neoliberal idea that progress will trickle down. Without understanding the particularity of forms of oppression, we risk reproducing the very exclusions that our movements seek to dismantle. Now, perhaps the strongest argument against identity politics that I've heard is that it has historically been promoted by a ruling class that thrives off of division amidst the rest of society, right? Some argue that, like I've mentioned, identity politics distracts from real politics, such as addressing economic inequality. Yet this critique often rests on an economic determinism that fails to recognize how race, gender, and other cornerstones of identity mediate access to material wealth, resources, opportunities. Having said that, the liberal tokenization of identity that we've kind of been talking a little bit about so far represents a shift away from authentic class-based analysis, fragmenting solidarity by promoting myopic views of struggle, constricting conceptualizations of identity, and refraining from dismantling the structures that underlie and sustain oppression. I draw your attention to two things here. A criticality, so that identity must continuously be problematized and, at the very least, complicated to allow for historicization, contextualization, and an awareness of identity as unifying and a collective force rather than a set of pre-political individual core traits. I also want to emphasize that there needs to be a class element at the core of our analysis, recognizing that capitalism underpins the racialized and gendered experiences worldwide. There is a valid critique that demands for race or gender-coded justice will solve all problems, when in reality these problems are a reflection of the deep contradictions of capitalism, not the cause. So I guess there exists this tension between the fragmentation of collective liberation and the homogenization of experiences of oppression. I'd say that the former unhelpfully distorts intersectionality, the point of intersectionality, whilst the latter risks erasing important differences. However, this doesn't contradict what I'm trying to say here, that the fight against the class system is key to dismantling oppression. And then I would also err on the side of this, a more nuanced analysis, really, that on one that positions capitalism within a broader analytical framework where race, gender, and other cornerstones of identity can be critically engaged with. This is essential for the meaningful political action that I'm calling for. Let us also reflect on the purpose of movements for social change. Are we seeking a generic liberation that erases difference, or a substantive liberation that acknowledges and celebrates it? A movement that refuses to engage with identity is a movement that fails to see the full humanity of the people it claims to be fighting for. Ultimately, our identities lie in each other as much as they do ourselves. The struggle for Palestinian liberation is tightly wound up with the neo-imperialism that child laborers in the Democratic Republic of Congo are risking their lives as a result of every day, that feeds into global late-stage capitalism, that fuels the climate catastrophe to which working class communities are particularly vulnerable. Interconnected identities and associated interconnected freedom projects are wrapped up in systems of violence. So identity politics are not a distraction. They are a clarion call to understand power more deeply, to engage in solidarity more authentically, and to build a future that is equitable and fair. I really do urge you to vote against the motion of the House today. I hope that if you've been on the fence so far, that at least I've led you to recognize that we can look past a liberal tokenization of identity and far-right traps that exploit it for division, that we need such a constructive, textured way of doing politics. For to ignore identity is to ignore the realities of oppression itself. The task before us is not to abandon identity politics, but to wield it as a tool for liberation, not just for some, but for all. Identity politics is not a distraction, it's the very heart of radical justice.